Hello, Chain Gang, and welcome back to the 4 Chains and Top 5 Friday. Today's list is the 5 greatest World Series of Poker players of all time. Now, if you're a regular subscriber and a viewer, thank you so much. You may be aware this is a little bit of a schedule change. Angie and I were actually hoping to be in Vegas at this time playing a tournament, raising some money for St. Jude's Children's Hospital, our favorite charity. Our travel plans changed and we were not able to do that, but we are definitely going to try to find a time to do that in the future, hopefully next year. And so instead, we are going to move this list up to now because as we tape this, the main event for 2023 is currently going on. Now, I want to say right off what this list is not. This is not simply the 5 greatest poker players of all time. Certainly all of these players are great. But Daniel Negreanu put a video out, which you should watch, where he talks about the Hall of Fame controversy, I think is what it says. And he points out that a lot of journalists and poker blogger type people like me are now voting on the Hall of Fame, but they don't have the same perspective as when only the players were voting for it, because the players are generally involved in the cash games, which is a huge part of being a poker player. And in the famous, Bobby's room, where the greats like Negreanu and Doyle Brunson and Phil Ivey played regularly, that was a big factor. And people like me only hear about big cash game moments anecdotally. So I eliminated that. I'm only talking about World Series of Poker tournaments. I'll judge by the reception of this video. If you want me to include all poker tournaments, I will. It's going to take more work. It's a harder video to make because, first of all, the amount of tournaments available for players to play has gone up and down over the years, and currently it's up to its highest level. But also, the stats are a little skewed because there's so many more high roller events, entry fees of $50,000, $100,000, $250,000 or more. It allows somebody who has had a very young career to just race up the all-time money list. And so I'll have Angie put up the all-time money list here, and some of those players you've heard of, and some of them, if you're a casual fan, maybe you hadn't. So this is just the simplest list. The World Series of Poker is currently going on, and so we're going to restrict it to this. For those of you who are regular watchers and subscribers, I do have some experience in the World Series of Poker. I've played there several times. There was a brief internet period of time where my friend Bruce Ryan filmed me playing a online tournament that was a qualifier for the main event. And it started out horribly, and I made a huge comeback, and I overreacted to the point where it became national news on ABC News, and a bunch of players, even recently, are making their own videos using that footage. But, I wouldn't say it made me famous, it made me infamous, but for 1 year, everybody at the World Series of Poker knew who I was. Full Tilt Poker signed me as a sponsor, and so I had access to those players behind the scene, and it did give me some perspective. I hope that experience did not influence my feelings, because I always try to take personal feelings out of the list. Speaking of personal feelings, everybody likes Eric Seidel. He is not on this list, but certainly deserving of mention because it's so close. I guess I would put him 6 on this list. Eric Seidel has 9 bracelets, but more importantly, he's really relevant now. In 2023, he made 2 final tables. And so the gap of his career, he's been able to be successful over many different eras. And essentially this list is the only 5 players who have had a more successful World Series of Poker career than Eric Seidel. But I'd like to point at least, position number 6 compared to position number 2 are relatively close. And let's say Eric Seidel won the main event this year, you could make the argument that that vaults him or any of the other living players on this list all the way up to number 2. But as of the snapshot now, during the 2023 main event, the 5 greatest World Series of Poker performances, players, careers are as follows. Number 5 is kind of a perfect entry in terms of what I'm talking about, because I think that if you took a poll of the 100 best living poker players right now and asked them who is the greatest poker player of all time, it would be the person at number 5 on my list. And just saying that, I bet you looking at this probably know who it is. It's Phil Ivey. The only reason Phil is, in all likelihood, not higher on this list, if not number 1, is he is so good at cash games. There's a famous story of him taking $16 million off of a Texas billionaire poker player over the course of 3 days. And his cash game exploits are very legendary, but that means that playing a lot of these tournaments is what poker players would call a negative EV for them, a negative expected value. No tournaments are negative expected value for Phil Ivey in and of themselves, unless you consider the fact that it's taking him away from cash games. So he has played less. But even with the less tournaments that he's played, he is tied for number 2 all time with bracelets. He has 10 of them. He has 82 cashes. He has $9 million in career earnings. And if I don't know where he'd be on if I made a list of just overall poker players, but Daniel Negreanu thinks he's number 1, and I have no reason to argue with that. Number 4, if Phil Ivey's the GOAT, the legend, and I'm guessing you know who I mean just by saying this, the legend, Doyle Brunson. When people pass away, particularly in the period of time right after they've passed away, and Doyle, as of taping this, he just passed away a couple weeks ago, there's a tendency to inflate their accomplishments. I don't think I'm doing that here with 4. I think you could make the argument that Doyle's 2. Doyle won his first bracelet in 1977 when he won the main event. His last bracelet was 2005. So that's a 28-year gap. That's enormous. He made a final table as late as 2018, and according to all reports, he was a force in cash games. As recently as that, as recently the past few years. Some people don't love Doyle because of his political views, but that's not what this is about. And I can tell you that the year that I had where I was spending time with these people, Doyle had every right to be dismissive of a young kid behaving in the way that I had behaved. And, he was already in a motorized wheelchair at that point. And, my brief interaction with him, he just kind of looked up at me and laughed and just patted me. And, you'll get through a kid, your 15 minutes of fame are almost up, and I've had 50 years of it. And both those things were true, and I did get through with it. So, Doyle, rest in peace. You're a legend. I think if you constructed a poker player, in a machine, it would be Doyle Brunson. Number 3, I think some people are going to think I have this guy ranked too high. At one point, he was overwhelmingly considered the greatest poker player of all time. And it's only recently he hasn't adapted as well as some other veterans to the, game theory optimization and, all the analysis of what chips are worth in a tournament and, all of these modern things. He hasn't done quite as well, but I would like to point out that this person, as we're speaking, is going into day 3 of the main event with 369,000 chips. And that man is Johnny Chan. Johnny Chan was the poker player that Matt Damon reveres and featured in the movie Rounders. That was his second consecutive main event win in a row over Eric Seidel, by the way, is who he faced heads up. And I would say that the GOAT, the greatest player of all time, has varied. At one point it was Doyle, and then You know, before hole cards were in, you had some aggressive players that were considered the best. But when Johnny Chan was considered the GOAT, I think there was more consensus about him being the GOAT than there ever has been on any player ever. And why is that? Well, he had a run that will never be repeated. He had a 3-year run in the main event where he went first, and then second, losing to Phil Helmuth that 3rd year. That would make him number 1 on this list if the main event fields were as large as they were today, but of course they are much shorter. And so Johnny Chan, who also has 10 bracelets, falls at number 3 on this list. Number 2, if there's ever a position where I let personal feelings get in the way, you could accuse me of it being here, because this person has been, very good to me, and he is my favorite player, and that is Daniel Negreanu. Now, for those of you that think I have him ranked too high at number 2, it's because, he has 6 bracelets. Johnny Chan and Doyle have 10. But it's not just the bracelets. I mean, he's been runner-up 10 times. He's finished 3rd 7 times. He's finished 4th through 9th an additional 31 times. He's 2nd all-time in World Series of Poker earnings. He has $21,800,000. By the time you're watching this, he may actually wind up being 1st. The person ahead of him is Antonio Esfandiari, who is a great guy, by the way, in real life. But, 18 of Antonio's $22 million in World Series of Poker earnings came in the one drop tournament, which was $1 million entry fee, and they don't even hold that anymore. So, I think when you consider what an ambassador he's been, and all of his success over such a long time, I think a ranking of number 2 is justified. I think that the people who are his distractors get a lot of mileage from the fact that Daniel's almost the only poker player that publishes his wins and his losses. Every year, he makes public the amount of money he spent on tournament fees and the amount of money he won in tournaments, even if as one year it was a negative. When he plays the World Series of Poker, like this year he has 12 cashes and he made a final table. If he wasn't so honest, everybody would think that's a great year, but he's down $720,000 overall. And so even though he's played pretty well, that's seen as a negative year in some people's mind. I'd like to point out that even though he's down $720, as I'm talking right now, he is in the money on a poker tournament. So that'll be his 13th cash. The other thing is that, Daniel, a lot of poker players were kind of nice to me that year, but Daniel was the only poker player that came out in public about it. I got made fun of for a quote, maybe Angie will put it up here, where I said I had the nuts the whole time. I meant the effective nuts. By the river, the nuts was 5-8 offsuit. But Daniel was a prominent person that pointed out that there's no chance this player could have had 5-8 offsuit in this particular hand. We know now that he did not have that. So in reality, I did have the nuts, and I appreciate Daniel pointing that out. Daniel's been very nice to my daughters. He signed autographs for them. They lost the autographs. He immediately signed them again. So if I have a rank too high, I'm going to live with that. I think that I've got to take a drink of water before I do this next one. Certainly my next pick proves that my personal feelings are aside. I almost didn't make this video despite how topical it is, because I did not want to utter the words. The number 1 greatest World Series of Poker player of all time is Phil Helmuth. Oh, jeez. God, I didn't want to say that. Phil is the only pro that treated me like crap that year. And all I was doing was shaking his hand. I had something actually nice to say to him. What you see on camera, that's not an act. That's who he is. The only player I've ever run into that's ruder than him is John Benetti. You probably don't know who John Benetti is, but Phil apparently has a big heart at times and can do some good things, but I've never seen that side of him. But this is a list on Marriot, and he's an easy pick as number 1 here. There's a famous quote where Daniel Negreanu said, that you don't do, to his face, you don't do anything better than Phil Ivey. But I think Daniel would admit he has the best WSOP resume. He has 17 bracelets. Second place is 10. If you look at the gap there, that's huge. His first bracelet was in the 1989 main event. And his most recent bracelet was this year, a couple of weeks ago, in a $10,000 entry fee tournament. So that's a span of 24 years and spans a lot of eras, and it's just really impressive. You know, I tried to dig deep to justify not putting him number one, but I just couldn't. He has the most final tables with 61. Big lead on Negreanu, who's the second most final tables. Phil has 14 runners-up to go with those 17 bracelets. He is number 3 all-time in amount of cashes. He's number 3 all-time in earnings. There is one good thing I want to say about him. If you've seen my goal-setting video, you know how important this is. When Johnny Chan was unquestionably the greatest player in the world, but also thought of as the greatest player of all time, he had seen Johnny win 2 main events in a row, and then he put on his answering machine, which used to leave messages before cell phones on cassette tapes on answering machines. And his incoming message that you would hear before leaving a message is, "Thank you for calling Phil Helmuth, the 1989 World Series of Poker main event." That winner, that message was on his voicemail from the week after the 88 main event until he won it. I don't know how long he kept it up there, probably until voicemails didn't exist anymore. If you know in my goal setting video, or I think I call it the New Year's resolution, one of the great parts about getting a goal is make yourself accountable by telling people you care about. Write it down. Tell people that you have that goal, because if you're not, you're giving yourself an out. He gave himself no out. Phil's a jerk. Phil's an asshole. So if he wouldn't have won the main event, he would have gotten crap for that voice message forever. And maybe nobody would ever heard of him, and maybe that would have been a good thing. But there's certainly a lesson to be learned there about setting a goal and going for it. And now if he could just make a goal of being less of an asshole, I would appreciate it. I think he's going to regret it when it's all said and done, how he treated people. But the rest of the people on this list won't do that. If you have a top 5 list you want to see, please put it in the comments. We have done or are going to do every list that anybody has requested in the comments so far. I imagine there are lists that probably I'm not knowledgeable enough to do. That's really egotistical. I'm sure there are lists I'm not knowledgeable enough to do. The only ones we have upcoming, we're going to be doing the top 5 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame snubs, top 5 worst Academy Award winners, and we're going to do one on top 5 parenting tips. So if you have a different suggestion, please do it, and we'll see you next time on Top 5 Friday with the 4 Chains.